Well, so, I finished 99% of this video prior to re-entering the waking nightmare, and held it mostly to talk about the Measure G results and, on the off chance that this happened. It seems blithe to talk about transit when we're staring down the barrel of open fascism with a man who has already tried to get the military to fire on protesters and was only stopped at the time by guardrails he knows now how to remove, and who has threatened unimaginable harm and violence across almost every aspect of American life. The best we can hope is that when the inevitable violence starts, America wakes up and finds its soul, and we actually manage to have non-sham elections in 4 years, which is optimism bordering on naivete, considering their open attempts to overturn 2020 with fake elector slates and just, well, open disregard for elections and the Constitution to date. Many people that voted for him, frankly, did not even hear meaningful discourse on any of this due to our siloed information ecosystems, which, to my eye, is the root cause from which everything else flows, and which has no obvious fix other than slow, grinding adaptation to figure out how to force glimpses of reality into these echo chambers. The GOP is so brazen and drunk with overconfidence right now that they may do it for us, and maybe this country will wake up and chart a course out of this in 4 years. I don't know. I have a daughter due within weeks of his inauguration, and the thought of this being her reality for the rest of her life is crushing. So all I can do is hope that collective good will ultimately overcome. But in the meantime, pushing the boulder up the hill in small and practical ways to help people in your community is sometimes the best we can do, so here I am with updates on transit. Anytime I discuss federal matching grants for certain projects like they're a given, well, for the next 4 years at least, now they won't be, to say the least. This will primarily affect the Southeast Gateway line. The Sepulveda line in Crenshaw North, for example, would not look for approval of federal money until the 2028 election winners administration, and, well, if the concept of fair elections goes tits up, then maybe California will step in with alternative funding. Our state legislature does seem to best find its spine when trying to protect California citizens from Trumpist federal policy, so we'll see how they do this time around. For once, Gavin Newsom desperately wanting to be president may help instead of hurt us. If anything, this all underlines even more sharply how we need to overhaul our clearance, design, engineering, and procurement processes to make every dollar we spend on transit go as far as it can go. And as for climate change, you better f***ing hope we figure out some geoengineering solution that doesn't accidentally kill us all. Welcome to hell. With that preamble, and with a fervent promise to not read any of the comments to this video, here is the mostly edited before the election update. Well folks, another year has passed. So let's see what kind of shit show the LA Metro construction and planning landscape is in late 2024. The new C&K line service pattern is already in effect, although with a gap between Westchester Veterans and Century Aviation because the LAX Metro Connector Station is not yet open. However, the full C&K lines, including that station, are planning to open by January. Will the LAX People Mover, now called Skylink, open with it? No. After a long contract dispute where each party dared the other to blink, LAX finally coughed up a lot more money for the contractor to finally get on with it, and despite it previously having been considered 97.7% done and already in testing, it is now back down to 86.4% done, because it's sort of based on contract value. And it is still not going to open until either December 2025, according to the contractor, or January 2026, according to LAX. Cool. Cool. Meanwhile, the consolidated rental car facility is already open and in use and is just using shuttles to reach the airport since the People Mover is so massively delayed. All of that means that 2 new extensions will now open before Skylink. The Foothill Gold Line extension to Pomona is set to complete construction and enter testing on January 3rd and open next summer, followed by Phase 1 of the D-Line extension to La Cienega in the fall, which has been exceeding expectations on timeline lately. That means that by the next time one of these annual update videos drops, we might be writing part of the D-Line extension. Finally, after all these years of patiently waiting. I continue to think that each of these D-line phases opening will add a huge number of new riders to the system, and I'm really looking forward to using it myself, as La Brea will become my closest rail station. The Orange County streetcar in Santa Ana, an OCTA project, will supposedly open to riders in the second half of 2025. Maybe this will give OCTA the bug for building rail? Who knows? Probably not. In the summer of 2025, we could potentially see the launch of a private sleeper train between Union Station and San Francisco called Dreamstar, which does sound pretty cool. This would be the only direct rail service between Los Angeles and San Francisco, as the Coast Starlight travels on the other side of the bay. That covers 2025, so let's move on to 2026. Division 20, the expanded B&D line yard that will allow for improved service, will open in the summer, along with Phase 2 of the D-line extension to Century City, with no second entrances at either Beverly Hills or Century City. Currently delayed to December of 2026 in a different county is San Bernardino's SPX Purple Line BRT, their second BRT line, and on the current schedule, that is it for 2026. In the summer of 2027, the NoHo-Pasadena BRT, which is still not under construction technically, is set to open, but the insane drift on the timeline for this project makes me generally quite leery. Under the original timeline, it was already supposed to be open by now. Debate over bus lanes on Olive continues still, as Metro board member Ara Najarian impressively decided to play hardball and withhold money for Burbank road projects until they approve the bus lanes, so kudos to him on that. Also that summer, Phase 3 of the D-line extension is back on track to open to Westwood in the VA. Meanwhile, the depressingly scaled-back G-line BRT improvements are now set to complete either at the end of 2027 or the start of 2028. Recall that they nixed elevating the G-line over Sepulveda with a new station, among other value engineering disappointments, which is, well, disappointing.
I am very disappointed!
And 2028 brings us to the Olympics, when we once dreamed we would be opening 28 transit projects. Let's check in on those again. Oh my, oh dear.
Oh dear.
Metro, knowing this looked, bad, released a revised list. So how are we doing on that list? Well, they added a few things that were already done a while ago, or are about to be done, because why not? Including this crucial grade separation on the main line in the gateway cities that's an important enabling project for California high-speed rail to Anaheim, which will be done next year. They also added some improvements to some downtown LA stations like 7th Metro, mobility hubs in the Valley and gateway cities, some bus lanes on Olympic and Venice, light rail improvements that seem to encompass the Washington Flower Junction despite them still not having decided on exactly what to do about it, so I very much doubt that there will be actual drastic changes to that junction by 2028, considering they've been putting off any further decision for years now. They do think that the now totally side-running Vermont North BRT will still be done by 2028, which, yeah, I can believe. And they seem to still think Broadway Quick Build BRT will be done in time. I will take that bet. Oh, and Brightline West starts major construction in January and still aims to be open before the Olympics. That is a very aggressive schedule, and if they can pull off an entire high-speed rail system faster than Metro can pull off quick build BRT lanes on Broadway, then we need to hire every goddamn person involved in that project and bring them in-house at the state level to start fixing all of our problems. And that'll be it for the Olympics probably, which are being branded as a car-free Olympics. They're likely going to paint some freeway and road lanes as Olympic vehicles only lanes. Wait, I thought they just had no cars. And they might let them be used by transit if they're feeling generous. But wait, what about the Inglewood Transit Connector, the thing that directly connects to the primary Olympics venue in SoFi? Samuel L. Jackson in Jurassic Park would say,
"Hold on to your
James
butts.
This will be a wild ride." The construction timeline kept drifting, leaving it with a 2029 opening date, which was not helpful, as it turns out the Olympics are a year prior to that. Still, utility relocations began anyway, as funding continued to get scraped together, and the contractor for the full build was even selected. The FTA approved it for a $1 billion federal grant, but that meant that Inglewood still had a shortfall, partly due to a larger federal contingency requirement. What else is new? They planned what they called a climate resiliency district to make up some of that, which I believe is just a fancy name for an EIFD in Inglewood. But then things started unraveling. The true turning point seems to have been the arenas, which are the primary beneficiaries of this system, and which have been at least miming support the whole time, being that they were being gifted a transit project to access their arenas for free from the public without chipping in 1 cent, which was already a little bit galling, pulling their support all of a sudden because, you guessed it, they are worried that the Inglewood Transit Connector would eat into their parking revenue. For quote-unquote environmentalist billionaire Steve Ballmer, owner of 2 of these 3 arenas, it turns out carbon-pumping gridlock was a feature and not a bug all along.
What was it like here last weekend?
Crazy. Pandemonium. I mean, like, every one of these streets and prairie was just lines and lines of traffic.
Connecting the dots, this seems to be the point at which Congresswoman Maxine Waters magically decided that she didn't actually like this project as much as she thought she did, and worked behind the scenes to pull the plug on the first $200 million of the $1 billion federal grant slated to go to the ITC, leaving an even larger shortfall to contend with for the ITC to raise with local and state money to still qualify for the remaining $800 million federal grant. Left with very few options, Inglewood Mayor and Metro Board member James Butts, the project's godfather, went to the South Bay Council of Governments, which oversees the Measure R and M projects in its subregion, and floated the idea of taking advantage of the provision in Measure M that allows them to reevaluate the funding splits once every 10 years, the first window fast approaching, and move highway money to transit. Now, regardless of what you think about this project, that was and remains a fantastic development. A Metro Board member coming out with a full-throated endorsement of using this window to move highway money to transit. And in fact, I've heard rumors that various Metro Board members are eyeing this window to snatch funding for their own Metro pet projects. The fact that we may actually be taking highway money for transit is incredible, and has been one of the key ways I keep suggesting projects could get accelerated, or maybe more realistically of late, at least somewhat stay on schedule. However, I also suspect that some less beloved projects may have been getting intentionally slow-walked until this deadline as well, possibly to suffer in favor of said pet projects of certain Metro Board members, explaining some of the otherwise inexplicable timeline delays. We shall see. But back to the ITC. The catch when it comes to moving this money is that the COG has to approve it, and the South Bay COG is one of the more hostile to transit in general. To sweeten the pot, Butts promised to pay that highway money back eventually, turning it more into a loan than a grant, sadly, and alarmingly also suggested, or at least someone did if not him, that the Torrance Extension money could get used for the ITC if the Torrance Extension got cancelled, which, excuse me, what? The Redondo Beach COG rep really wants that project cancelled, but let's not actually incentivize that, please and thank you. Meanwhile, the COG staff balked, pointing out that a massively disproportionate amount of COG transit money was already going to Inglewood versus the other COG cities, and Maxine Waters and the stadiums came out to lean hard on them. In a narrow vote, the COG struck down Butts' proposal, leaving the ITC all but dead in the water. It isn't officially dead yet, but even Butts has admitted that there's not really a path forward now. All that time, all that money promised from the feds, from the state, from Measures R and M, to the detriment of other projects, and here we are. All wasted at the behest of fickle billionaires who play act as environmentalists, terrified that their parking revenue will decrease. Late stage capitalism, folks. May we all choke on exhaust fumes. One might reasonably ask, how did we get here? How did the stadium and arena manage to get built without a plan to sustainably address the gridlock when that sort of consideration is the bedrock of why our insanely onerous environmental law, CEQA, exists in the first place? Well, that's easy. These projects got to skip past many CEQA steps. Not because they're obviously environmentally beneficial projects, of which we're in dire need, like transit. Oh no, those will still get trapped in the decade-long environmental review. These are CEQA exempt because, I'm grasping around for a reason here. You know, I really just can't figure it out. It's a huge mystery. Someone should look into this. So where do we go from here? Well, it seems that the LA region will just straight up lose $1 billion in federal funding that we will never get back, which is the most crushing part of all of this. There's about $520 million from the state that had been slated for this project, mostly from 2 different TIRCP cycles, and I think that's supposed to remain in region. It could go to the Southeast Gateway line, which was a runner-up that got no funding in at least one of those cycles and which desperately needs it. It could go to the Torrance Extension, which is in the same COG subregion, but the $250 million for Measure R and the $108 million for Measure M have to stay within the subregion. So my guess is Torrance picks up some of that, or it's picked over by the local cities for a myriad of tiny projects. Though I do have a suggestion. A Reddit user recently pointed out how valuable the Brea BRT line would be for the Olympics, able to shunt slightly to hit these venues that the ITC will no longer serve, and connect broadly to east-west lines that serve Olympic venues, but in lieu of the future Sepulveda line and K Northern Extension, do not have an easy way to connect on a north-south corridor. The Westside COG wants BRT on La Brea, despite it not being a metro project, although it was removed from their most recent list, suggesting that by BRT they really do just mean bus lanes, not real full BRT, because side-running bus lanes have already been painted on the northern section and are slated to run down further to Coliseum Street. Given all that, and in the wake of the ITC cancellation, I would propose either a La Brea BRT that spans all the way from Hollywood to PCH, with a diversion to Prairie and back via Manchester and Century for the arenas, and with center-running bus lanes for the remainder of the lines south of Coliseum instead of side-running, or a La Brea BRT that doesn't divert but connects with a loop circulator BRT in Inglewood on the same route, or at the absolute very least, a loop circulator BRT in Inglewood by the Olympics. The problem? This would have to actually be quick-build BRT, which I'm not sure Metro is capable of. But it would qualify for that Measure R and M money and the state money, and the ITC's cancellation will bring up hard questions about serving these venues for the Olympics, even though those questions should have already been asked given this project's previous delay to 2029. Butts would basically have to switch and make this his baby and ram it through for it to happen, and I do not have confidence in that, so I'm not going to leave it drawn on the map. But a full La Brea BRT line continuing down Hawthorne would serve many South Bay cities, perhaps making the COG more amenable to it. I recommend asking the Metro Board, James Butts, and the South Bay COG for this immediately, because for it to happen, the ball would have to start rolling now. Okay, time to move on. While some of Metrolink's score projects will be done by 2028, and better scheduling is rolling out, the program as a whole has been beset by setbacks. NIMBYism has managed to kill some critical double tracking, such as in the Valley on the Ventura County line, and lack of necessary funding has led to our old nemesis value engineering coming back to haunt us as projects get slashed and slashed again, and delayed again. One potential solution to some of these problems is a 4-county ballot measure proposed by Move LA to provide Metrolink with funds. Unfortunately, this measure, as of now, does not seem like it'll pursue the original goal of funding electrification for Metrolink, now CEQA exempt, instead having made a truce with the hydrogen lobby. Now, I recently ranted long and hard about this issue, so I don't need to repeat it in full here, but suffice to say that Metrolink has been showing anemic leadership on, well, most fronts, but especially in resisting electrification in favor of incredibly expensive, unproven, and not even green hydrogen that has been pushed by the fossil fuel industry. There will probably be some debate about this ballot measure, and I very strongly think electrification needs to be one of its primary goals. Feel free to share your thoughts with Move LA, just do so kindly. In related news, at the beginning of this year, several important transit advocacy groups have called for a total reform of our rail governance system, and boy, are they right. I would love to see this continue to get pushed. So, back to the timeline, with the graveyard of projects that we once hoped would be opened by the Olympics. While not as concrete as all of the previous projects, which are mostly at least in some form underway, this next batch of projects has tentative opening dates, even if they keep slipping. After years of trying, Metro has finally managed to get the final 2 stations of the Foothill Extension, the always hilariously named pair of Claremont and Montclair, fully funded, and they're now set to open in 2030, 2 years after Claremont at least was targeted to open the original 28 by 28. Good news and bad news with Link Union Station. Good news is it should finally start construction next summer. Bad news is it lost a federal mega grant. It's now being opposed by the 3 warehouses in a trench coat posing as a city named Vernon, and it has been value engineered to all hell. It has gone from 10 run-through tracks converging to 4, to a paltry 2 run-through tracks, with options to expand later to 8 run-through tracks, but still converging to 2. The convergence to 2 from 4 is the real gut punch here. That basically slashes in half our ability to use these tracks broadly across the system, and I really hope that when high-speed rail finally goes in, they figure out a way to get it back to a convergence to 4. Once envisioned with a 2028 opening, and is now expected in 2031. Once envisioned with an opening as early as 2027, and maybe even 2026, although I'm too lazy to dig around and find that right now, the original 28 by 28 listee of Phase 1 of the East San Fernando Valley Line is now also expected in 2031. All its grants are finalized, and the first of the main construction contracts was finally awarded, but this feels like it's been crawling at a snail's pace. Also, deeply ironic that the one project where value engineering could actually improve it, by removing some of its redundant stations to speed up the line, somehow managed to escape the value engineering reaper, and it seems like we're moving forward with a full build of Phase 1 as is. Then we are looking at a huge 4-year gap of nothing opening before the final 4 major projects on the original 28 by 28 list open in or around 2035. Let's start with the Sepulveda line, whose EIR keeps getting delayed. It seems fall of 2025 is now the likely date, which has led to me shifting the expected opening date so much later. To be clear, this one's a guess from me and not from any official report. So where are we on arguably the most important transit project in the US? Well, the bridge troll of Bel Air continues to haunt the project, calling UCLA students arrogant and misguided for feeling they are entitled to a station. The irony of those words might literally kill me. Putting out ads with an attempt at humor that can only be described as vaguely Victorian? Declaring that his holiday wish was for everyone at Metro HQ to find themselves locked inside. Demanding again that Metro preserve documents for pending litigation, including, hilariously, any that mention him. Getting an annoyingly uncritical profile in The Hollywood Reporter where he claims he's raised 7 figures for litigation, surely to some vulture lawyer's delight. Claiming that the Sepulveda line will cost a hilarious $35 billion, based on, one must presume, the voices he hears in his head, and then soon after expanding that estimate up to $60 billion, and claiming it will take until 2050 to get built. Which you think would be a salve for him, considering he's like 120 years old and absolutely won't be around to see that. He's made comments suggesting that he would demand community benefits for the famously impoverished neighborhood of Bel Air in return for allowing tunneling, perhaps the first indication that he has had a brief and no doubt troubling encounter with reality. He seemingly successfully got Metro to remove Community Relations Officer Jody Litvack from the project after he has spent years verbally abusing her, which is just wild that Metro would bend over meekly for him like that. He once famously grifted McKinsey to overhaul Metro, and has managed a very modest legal victory against Metro in that a judge has said that Metro must at least detail why it is withholding some documents rather than giving a boilerplate response, which is basically just creating useless busy work for Metro, which of course is the point of all this, to delay the project ad infinitum. Meanwhile, his Soha sidekick, or minion, and Bob Anderson demanded Metro answer 20 ridiculous questions, which they actually did to try to mollify him, which led to him throwing another fit because he didn't like the answers, and has opined that Metro may be trying to poison him, leading to my ultimate conclusion that someone really needs to ask these two chuckle f***s if they can draw a clock. In real news on the project, Monorail Alternative 2 has been removed from consideration hilariously at BYD's own request because it would have cost an absolutely comical amount of money by building an entirely separate underground people mover line. Hey, maybe that's the $60 billion that Rosen was talking about. Alt 4, the cheapest heavy rail alternative where the line is elevated in the valley, and to my eyes the best alternative, securing almost all of the benefits of the other heavy rail alternatives for a lower price, seems to be getting less and less likely due to the city's insane obstinance on elevated rail, which is something we have just got to get over. Bel Air lackey Congressman Brad Sherman has come out hard against Alt 4 and is demanding that if heavy rail is chosen, tunnels stay below 100 feet in Bel Air, a demand that would only change the depth under 7 measly homes, but would probably cost an absolute fortune. He also met with the monorail and forced a Metro rep to leave the meeting, not raising any eyebrows at all, and is trying to help the monorail make their alternatives more attractive to the public. Bechtel, meanwhile, has chosen some pretty Stadler automated trains for its 2 heavy rail alternatives. What to make of all this? Well, concerningly and almost incomprehensibly, I've been hearing that the monorail may actually be less of a threat than no build. To this point, I don't think any normal person in LA could have ever imagined that this, again, the most important transit project in the United States, could ever actually be just totally kiboshed. Like, no one would be crazy enough to do that. But the dominoes seem to be getting lined up to try to make that happen. Remember when I said all this ruckus around Alt 4 was to attempt to make the only politically feasible heavy rail alternative Alt 5, the most expensive one? Yep, I was exactly right about that, because the likely higher cost of Alt 5, not $60 billion to be clear, probably more like a quarter of that, I'd guess, has led to fears among some Metro board members, apparently, that the budget of the Sepulveda line might pull money away from their own pet projects. And none of them, distressingly, seems to consider the Sepulveda line to be one of their pet projects. There is an inherited reflex among LA politicians, honed over the last century, to cower in fear of the homeowners associations that have dominated our elections. They are terrified of So Hot in the Valley demanding that Alt 4 be killed, and of Fred Rosen and Bel Air splattering the project with verbal diarrhea on a daily basis. Despite the fact that the realignment of LA elections with federal ones has massively blunted the electoral power of these incredibly wealthy and non-representative organizations, they somehow can't see that torpedoing the will of literally the entire county of constituents for the most important transit project in the country at the behest of the most cartoonish villain that one could ever imagine, one that any politician should frankly salivate to have as a foil, will decapitate their political careers in an instant. Look at the reaction to Kathy Hochul doing another version of exactly this in New York. Tell me if you think she is ever going to win another election. She has become the entire New York City metro area's public enemy number 1. She has personally massively worsened the lives of millions upon millions of people in the way that most bad actor politicians could never dream of accomplishing with one single action. For our politicians to look at that and say, hey, I want to get in on that, is not something that I imagine being possible. But apparently this is a real problem that we're going to have to contend with when this EIR finally drops, hopefully next fall. The time between the EIR drop and the LPA selection is going to be a fight of massive proportions, and in the time between then and now, we need to make sure we have a gargantuan coalition flooding every Metro board member's office with constant entreaties to select a heavy rail alternative. And anyone living in the Valley asking Valley politicians for specifically Alt 4 only helps this even more. This should be the easiest decision in the world, but our politicians look poised to utterly fail us. So we need to remind them that Fred Rosen didn't elect them. We did. The good news is, the Metro Board is capable of having a spine every now and then. Despite a Parks and Rec level performance from the NIMBYs in the South Bay,
and I've got to say, I'm not a fan of sending hundreds of trains a day through a quiet neighborhood.
The board actually did choose the superior hybrid alignment for the Torrance Extension, with James Butts quite hilariously trying to mollify the critics by literally gaslighting them, telling them,
I just want to make it clear, you were very successful.
And leaving them, instead of angry, just extremely confused. Opening date is likely 2035, despite, again, having been on the original 28x28 list, so there is that. The Eastside E-Line Extension Phase 1 to Greenwood, another original 28x28 project, is expected also in 2035. The current work is to try to close a staggering $4.5 billion funding gap. This line is costing $1.7 billion a mile for light rail. I know. I'm not even sure what to do with that information other than just have a little cry. It's restarting the NEPA review required to apply for federal grants, though with that kind of cost per mile, I don't know how optimistic I would be about all of that. If all goes well, which it probably won't, it would start construction in 2029. And the last of our original 28 by 28 projects currently slated to open in 2035 is Phase 1 of the Southeast Gateway Line, which has spent the last decade living out its own nightmare series of unfortunate events. There's a new, albeit probably minor, legal battle brewing with a business on the route. Metro still hasn't secured the site for the maintenance yard, a paintball facility that Bellflower wants to turn into housing, and funding problems continue to absolutely plague the project. It wants to get an FTA rating by year's end, which should inform us whether it is likely to be awarded federal grants, which will be a very big deal. A bad rating could endanger the whole project. But the budget has increased yet again to an absolutely eye-popping $8.662 billion. And Metro would need to secure 50% of that budget with local and state funds by the end of 2026 in the current timeline to qualify for federal matching grants, despite it constantly failing to get state money. Although it finally just got awarded $231 million from California's latest TIRCP cycle. But it asked for $500 million. Maybe, like I said, some of the ITC's money can come back to it though. One plan to mitigate costs, though it may seem paradoxical at first blush, is to let the local cities along the line out of their required 3% budget contribution in return for master permitting authority, something I talked about in the Cost and Timelines video, that could save them more money in the long run. On the plus side, they finally reached an agreement with Union Pacific around the freight tracks it will relocate. The Southeast Gateway Line is a good project serving transit-dependent communities, and it would be crushing to see this line fail to get the money it needs. But if it does fail, it'll be because Metro has utterly failed to contain the spiraling costs, to say nothing of the drifting timelines that further impact costs. Because here, finally, in 2035, we are scheduled to finish all the projects we once had on the 28 by 28 list. I've charted some predicted opening dates over the years since my annual update videos started in 2020, and, well, you can see that things are bleak. We have decades of construction lined up, and should be getting to the point where we can move through these projects like butter, but we're getting worse. Projects are increasingly massively over-engineered, suffocating under endless community engagement, tiptoeing in constant fear of lawsuits from convenience fee tycoons, despite being ever more protected by the law and legal precedent as Metro wins court battles, and the environmental process has slowed to an absolute crawl. The DEIR for the entire D-Line subway extension, all 3 phases, took about a year and a half between February 2009 and October of 2010. We are now approaching the 8th year since the board asked to start the Arts District DEIR, a project consisting of a single at-grade station on existing tracks of that same line. This is a 5-alarm fire at Metro. I have made a whole video about everything that's wrong, and it's a lot, but even knowing all of this, Metro is not making meaningful changes or meaningful progress. Every step forward they take on one issue seems countered by 3 steps back on another. We need experienced, permanent, in-house design, engineering, environmental clearance, and procurement teams that can rotate between projects. These teams should be in-house either at Metro or a massively reformed Caltrans, which would then handle these parts of all projects for Metro and all the in-state transit agencies. We need leadership to care enough to fight for this. To say, I know this is upsetting 1,000 apple carts, most of said carts being consulting firms that politicians probably don't feel like pissing off, but this process of farming everything out to a new consulting firm every project is fundamentally broken, and it needs to rapidly change. We need leadership. Please, for the love of God, I am losing my mind watching the slow motion unraveling. Somebody with the power to do so needs to step up and make this their crusade. This could and probably should be Stephanie Wiggins, head of Metro. It could and also probably should be any number of people on the Metro board. It could be a state representative who builds a coalition in our Democratic supermajority to create a team like this on the state level and dictate that Metro f***ing use it. I don't care who it is, but it needs to be somebody. With the recent passage of Measure G, which expands the County Board of Supervisors from 5 to 9 and adds a county executive position, the question of Metro Board makeup, since county supervisors are automatically on the board, is going to the state. Meaning that we are suddenly in literally a once-in-a-lifetime window of opportunity for Metro Board reform. The problem is that it is a 60-day window, and the plan is submitted to the state legislature by the board itself, which is not about to dilute its own power. But the state should have the authority to override it, meaning that along with very time-sensitive pressure to push for the Brea BRT to replace the likely canceled ITC, we need our transit advocacy groups to immediately make a unified push on state representatives for Metro Board reform. And honestly, I don't know what exactly that looks like. Some early discussion has suggested directly elected board members who are answerable solely for their decisions on Metro, current or former planning professionals that are appointed, perhaps by the current Metro CEO, or even a writer advocate. I would encourage active discussion with and among our knowledgeable transit advocacy groups in the coming days, and a unified push to state representatives from these groups and constituents to make the Metro Board less worried about political concerns external to their board roles, composed of members with the proper expertise to make informed decisions rather than piling on over-engineered change on top of over-engineered change, and especially more representative of the actual ridership of Metro, which the board famously is not. I will briefly note with sadness that it appears that San Diego's Measure G, which is similar to our Measure R and M, although far less ambitious, will fail by a hair, although that could still change. I feel a little guilty as I considered doing a piece on it, like I did about Measure M back in 2016, but I couldn't really find the time, although I'm not self-aggrandizing enough to think that would have affected the outcome. The upside is, LA had Measure J fail in 2012 and came back with a much more ambitious Measure M in 2016, which succeeded. And San Diego has the opportunity to come back with a measure that promises more than just a handful of projects, which could help to better build a county-wide coalition that would help to pass it. Now, speaking as we just were of over-engineering, Crenshaw North. You may have seen a different rant of mine about crossovers on the Crenshaw North video. After years of waiting, the DEIR is finally out, and the cost projections are astronomical, partly because the project is massively over-engineered. Every excavated station palace contains a massive high-speed crossover except one, with one containing two, and you really only need one, say, every 3 stations at the end of phases. Plus, the depth of the line is sometimes quite deep, leading to even higher excavation costs, although they're using that depth as a positive to try to mollify residents that, you guessed it, are screaming about a train running under their homes despite it being literally undetectable and Metro paying the money for it. Metro, though, at least has assured that this is only an initial design and that it'll be poured over to see how costs can be controlled, hopefully leading to the shortening or demise of many of these crossovers at least. The still very likely to be chosen hybrid costs $14.8 billion, and one hopes that will go down for once instead of up. The Hollywood Bowl station, due to extremely difficult conditions, would cost an additional $1.12 billion for a single station, so it's pretty safe to say that that's off the table for now, until perhaps a future unplanned extension to Burbank. Fairfax and La Brea alignments would be built in 2 phases, but the hybrid alignment would take 3. It's incredibly difficult to say when these phases would actually open because different documents suggest different timelines, and it would also depend on how quickly funding could be secured. Measure M's paltry $2.23 billion for this project doesn't become available until 2041, so the non-federal half of this would need to raise most or all of the $7.4 billion remaining on the hybrid with an EIFT, or perhaps by shifting highway funds, although I don't know what the implications of the latter are on the timeline since those would be coming out of Measure M. Phase 1, according to one document, could open by 2034, earlier than most of those 28 by 28 projects, though I would not count on that. Phase 3 could open anywhere between 2043 and 2050, depending on your level of optimism on any given day. Of course, this whole project should open by 2034, but that is sadly not the reality in which we find ourselves. The comments period is now closed on the EIR, and we're awaiting the Metro Board's decision on the routing. But if this isn't the hybrid, I will be genuinely shocked. The only thing that could topple it in my mind is that extra required phase, pushing back the date that WeHo gets their stations, where they would still get Fairfax and La Brea stations with the Fairfax alignments, and sooner. There is an outside chance of that, but I haven't seen any of the relevant advocacy groups making that argument or abandoning the hybrid, so I don't expect the Metro Board politicians to do it either. But guess what? Another existential problem has appeared. Those homeowners I mentioned complaining about the already super deep tunnels under their homes, despite Metro pointing out that the D-line just tunneled under expensive homes just fine, and that even shallow tunnels, much less deep ones, would have no surface impacts, and that the homeowners are getting paid easements anyway, and already having an on-the-books studied alternative that costs more and takes longer to avoid most of the area by tunneling under Crenshaw, Metro has decided to not even bend over backwards for them, so much as shatter its own spine, a metaphor that works on a number of levels, by delaying the board decision to enact yet another study to further see if they can avoid this, again, completely impactless tunneling under even more homes, tightening this curve even further, costing even more money, and making the line even slower to appease, I cannot stress this enough, completely unfounded fears. There is no functional difference from if these homeowners said, "We oppose this project out of fear of mole people popping up from the tunnels," and Metro's response being, "Well, okay, mole people aren't real, but they are afraid of mole people regardless, so I guess we can't build this project unless we pay a consulting firm to design for us patented anti-mole person tunnel linings." Literally the same. Do you see why our projects keep getting insane cost and timeline escalation? But the risk to Crenshaw North's budget and timeline isn't even the scariest impact of this. The scariest impact? It lends a mountain of credence for Bel Air to say in court, well, they avoided tunneling under them because of their concerns, so they must also avoid tunneling under us. It's not an exaggeration to say that by issuing this delay and commencing this study, Metro may have just killed the Sepulveda line. 8 years ago when we passed Measure M, we were optimistic little f***ers. But in the time since, Metro leadership has led us to the cancellation of the North San Fernando Valley BRT line, the ITC, even though it wasn't technically a Metro project, and quite possibly due to cost overruns and NIMBY pushback, the Eastside Extension, the South Bay Extension, the Southeast Gateway line, the Sepulveda line, and Crenshaw North. The clock ticks for all of them. Which leaves us with the East San Fernando Valley line? Once again, we need new leadership. Back to our regularly scheduled video. The timing of everything that follows is not worth predicting. I might give you some reported dates, but take them with a grain of salt. I'm dividing it into 4 sections. Phase 2s, Mainline Rail, BRT, and a final grab bag. Let's start with Phase 2s. The Eastside second phase and Sepulveda second phase haven't had a peep said about them in over a year, as everyone is just trying to make Phase 1 happen before thinking about them. The East San Fernando Valley line second phase is late on returning its report to the board, which should now hopefully come this winter, with a decision on it not too long after. I continue to think this will just be an infill Metrolink station at Pacoima. Meanwhile, despite Metro having made truly admirable cuts to the cost by designing a partly aerial alignment of the second phase of the Southeast Gateway line, residents are, you guessed it, demanding that it be built underground, suggesting that an EIFD could pay for it. Of course, that same EIFD could help pay for the above-ground version too. The nth report on this segment will be given to the board this winter, allegedly, and there is, I believe, a timeline date of 2043 for this segment, but you know. Let's talk Mainline Rail for a minute. The study for a Pico Rivera Metrolink station should be done next summer, and they're looking at either Rosemead or Paramount for the station. In my view, Rosemead is the obvious choice because it would connect to a future BRT line there. No word lately on other Metrolink infills at Placentia or LAUSC Medical Center, or the, I believe, 4 proposals now to move stations. But I'll go ahead and move El Monte on this map. Off the map, Metrolink did just get awarded state money to build an infill Mead Valley station on the 91 Paris Valley line, somewhere between downtown Paris and Moreno Valley March Air Force Base. The long-awaited rail integration study finally released its report. There had been suggestions that it was going to recommend an S-Bahn style line, running frequent metro-like service on mainline tracks from downtown Burbank to Norwalk Santa Fe Springs, utilizing Link Union Station run-through tracks, and potentially building local infill stations. But this was changed in the final report to a quote-unquote tripper service, traveling between Chatsworth and Laguna Niguel Mission Viejo, with hourly service, the potential for half-hourly service, and no infills. This new proposal is more akin to a traditional Metrolink line, so I will draw it on as such, and it can be implemented alongside current service. It also recommends the Surfliner stopping at some stations, a host of station bus and Metrolink improvements, and that a shuttle be run between C-Line Norwalk Station and Norwalk Santa Fe Springs until that C-Line extension to the latter station finally gets built, but not going so far as to recommend accelerating it, probably because they know Metro is utterly incapable of it. Santa Barbara wants Metrolink service, which could start with a pilot program that sees a morning train traveling from Moore Park to Galeta, and a mid-morning return all the way to Union, utilizing an existing Surfliner train for the evening commute. I'll keep an eye out for more developments on that. As expected, a Long Beach Metrolink line did not make the cut for funding from the cancelled 710 South pot of money. Maybe one day, but not this day. That pot of money is funding a battery electric freight rail pilot with Union Pacific, though, interestingly. Let's move over to Amtrak. With the Surfliner, we actually have had an elected show real leadership in State Senator Catherine Blakespear, who is focusing on getting the Surfliner the money it needs for the various improvements needed to keep the train from, falling into the ocean, as the tracks keep insisting on doing at Del Mar Bluffs and San Clemente. And some state money was just awarded for this, along with other improvements along the line. Meanwhile, the proposed Coachella Valley Intercity service is getting more money from the FRA to fund planning and development, a very positive step courtesy of the Corridor ID program, which is also awarding money into the Lawson Corridor used by the Surfliner, Brightline West, the High Desert Corridor, and California High-Speed Rail. Let's talk about those last two. The High Desert Corridor continues to see a surprising amount of planning, with an exact route now identified. Since this would connect Brightline West and California High-Speed Rail north of the Palmdale station, there are options for a San Francisco to Vegas train that either bypass Palmdale or go into Palmdale station and back out of it. California High-Speed Rail got its recommended LPA for Anaheim, which sees no intermediate stations between Union and Anaheim, and sadly does not grade separate the final approach to Anaheim on publicly owned tracks to save money. Quite annoyingly, these high-speed rail trains will take the exact same amount of time to travel between Union and Anaheim as current Metrolink trains, because Metrolink refuses to electrify their lines, forcing the entire crowded segment to travel at slower speeds so they don't, run into the train in front of them. Yay! Thanks, Metrolink, doing a great job over there. In funding news, Brightline West and California High-Speed Rail each got $3 billion from the federal government, which put Brightline West off to the races, and which helps California High-Speed Rail inch toward an iOS opening in the Central Valley, while still staring down a massive shortfall and without having begun construction on either end sections of the iOS. So what's gonna happen with California High-Speed Rail? I imagine the new Trump administration will attempt to do everything in its power to kill it, so say goodbye to federal dollars for at least 4 years. I don't know if they technically have the ability to cancel the $3 billion already awarded, but if they can, I'm certain they will. Best case is the state legislature finds a way to pump enough dollars into it that it can limp toward an iOS, and San Francisco and LA legs get backburnered until the country manages to unfuck itself, hopefully within my lifetime. Brightline West, being private, will probably find a way to survive, because if there's one thing Republicans like, it's privatizing everything. The San Gabriel Valley COG transit study suggested that passenger rail service be considered in the long term on the Alhambra subdivision, which just so happens to be a proposal of mine that I discussed in the Ontario Airport video and will be discussing again shortly in the second future planning video. I don't expect to see movement on this anytime soon, but it's heartening that they're talking about it. Due to pessimism, I'm leaving these sort of maybe in the future proposals off the map this year where I would have included them in the past. Speaking of said proposals, there's been some discussion of adding back Coast Daylight service, traveling on the tracks that the Coast Starlight uses but veering to San Francisco instead of Oakland, and continuing south to San Diego, running more frequently than the Starlight. BRT time. Streets for All has put out an impressive detailed proposal for what it calls the Hill to Sea corridor along Lakewood and Rosemead. This stitches together and extends various understeady BRT lines from the San Gabriel Valley and Pico Rivera, and will hopefully help to build a coalition to advance this BRT outside of the auspices of Measure M. Within the auspices of Measure M, the segment of this route covered by the San Gabriel Valley BRT study, along with its east-west route, is now aiming for a 2035 debut in its final proposal. If all of these 2035 dates hold, which they won't, and I'll include the first phase of Crenshaw North here, as it would be about then probably, that would be an insane year for the LA Metro, with literally all of this opening within 12 months. I will be in my late 40s. Not relevant, just a depressing little intrusive thought I had. Meanwhile, there is a lot of finger-pointing in the city of Alhambra over why Alhambra's Valley Boulevard segment was removed from consideration for the San Gabriel Valley BRT. They're basically playing their own little game of Clue over there, where the city manager seems to maybe be the suspect they should be keeping their eye on. The Westside COG is looking to spend $14.9 million on bus lanes, for which it only has $6.7 million from Measure M so far, in pursuit of its many BRT goals. I don't think that the lanes alone could or should qualify this as BRT yet, and I don't know whether the COG has plans to go further, but they are taking this first step. I will, however, leave these off the map as BRT this year given the ambiguity. I know, I'm fickle. Although, one of these routes would be Lincoln, which is a late Measure M project, so we'll draw that. And two others are La Cienega and Venice, which are also quick-build BRT routes in Measure M's countywide BRT program, so I'll draw those, along with the Sunset and Atlantic BRTs that same program should one day fund. Other potential BRT lines that have been suggested are as follows. From Metro's survey on how to use the 105 Express Lanes money, there were possibilities of funding the southern portion of Vermont BRT and Sepulveda BRT between 80th and LAX. And then the 710 North study recommends funding something that looks like BRT, with bus lanes and stations, I think, on Valley between Union and the 710 stub. Man, Alhambra sure is missing out, aren't they? Finally, let's go to Grab Bag. No real news on the very distant projects of the Orange Line conversion or the C Line extension to Norwalk Santa Fe Springs, other than the rail integration study's shuttle proposal. Officials are still trying to figure out the Gold Line to Burbank Airport study that was ordered in 2021 and given $1 million. The Dodger Stadium gondola, which I don't consider to be transit and which I am indifferent to, please don't yell at me, finished its EIR and continues to polarize. Bass is okay with it moving forward under certain conditions, including adding affordable housing on Chavez Ravine. The next hurdle for it, though, is the inevitable string of lawsuits, so expect to see news continue about those. It'll probably actually be better for Metro's other projects if the gondola wins those lawsuits. Ontario Airport is still pursuing its goddamn Tesla tunnels, but it hilariously got completely slapped down by the state and was awarded $0 in state grants, thank God. It's actually currently in a public comments period, so I highly encourage San Bernardino County residents to yell at your electeds. This thing is peak stupidity. Ask instead for a DMU shuttle to Rancho Cucamonga Station that can convert to an Aero extension and or an A-Line extension, especially since we're now funding it to Montclair. An Ontario connection would increase the return on that Montclair investment by a lot. The contractor for the Vermont BRT study will be commencing on a rail study once the BRT study is done. My hope is that they take the suggestion from a losing contractor to route a new Vermont rail line to Westlake MacArthur Park to allow for a future extension to Glendale. I'd be surprised if it doesn't become one of the alternatives, but we shall see. There is of course no money slated for this rail line, despite it being the city's busiest bus corridor, so this will likely be another place where shifted highway money, EIFD money, and state funding are cobbled together to reach the required amount for a federal match. Speaking of EIFDs, one thing a downtown one might do is fund a grade separation of Pico Station. But one thing it won't do is fund the Arts District Station, still in EIR purgatory. There continues to be no news on this, but Assuming it actually does get built, it'll probably be with Central LA Measure M discretionary money, which I'm pretty sure at one point got officially slated for it, even if that's no longer the case now. Platform extensions on the South Bay Now K-Line station should commence next year and complete before the Olympics, after talking about it for ages. These will allow 3-car trains on the whole line. The downtown streetcar project, which honestly is kind of a stupid project, is in more limbo than purgatory, with nothing happening and politicians seeming to hope that no one notices. I don't think many people really want this thing, and rightly so, but our Lord and Savior Numble suspects that no politician wants to take the blame for killing it just in case, so here we are. This has not been a great 12 months for Metro since my last annual update video, to say the least. There are multiple projects that we are further away from seeing than we ostensibly were 4 years ago. While we absolutely need to be vigilant in advocating for the best alternatives for things like the Sepulveda line, a lot of our collective effort right now should really be on leaning on Metro and relevant politicians to start providing some sort of leadership, to create a real paradigm shift on how our transit agencies operate. Because the system is broken. Bad actors from 3 warehouses dressed as a city to a single shambling shell for a melted brain can cause massive disruptions, while simultaneously decrying the disruptions they caused as proof that Metro is incompetent. And even worse, we're about to be on our own, with no likely federal help for anything. I know transit is not going to be the banner issue in the foreseeable future, but at the very least, California just got a kick in the butt to prove that progressive governance works better, and that it's needed to protect its people. Above all, stay safe out there, and I'll hopefully see you on a D-Line train pushing a stroller before the next annual update video is out.